All right. So before we get started, did anybody give any thought or look over any more information on the, um, I want to call them question papers, the signature assignment and ePortfolio specifically? So any questions on ePortfolio at this point? You've still got plenty of time in between now and when it's due. Just wanted to see if there's any questions after we talked about it last time. All right, well, if that's the case, let's jump into the lecture material. So we stopped when we were talking about crystallized intelligence last time, and I said we were going to have a little video to watch on crystallized intelligence. So essentially what this video, we'll review crystallized intelligence too in just a minute, but essentially for this video, it's a problem. So you're trying to figure out a solution to this problem, and it takes some fluid intelligence to figure it out. So it's kind of a fluid intelligence test. It's just one test, but you can find similar kinds of tests like that online as well, or in books. So mind trick kind of things. So I think it's pretty interesting to see who does figure it out and who does not. So crystallized intelligence, again, is something that's continuously being built throughout your life. So it's that knowledge, verbal skills. If you're learning a new language, that's called crystallized intelligence. Everything you know about psychology now, that is now part of your crystallized intelligence. Everything you know about your job, that's part of your crystallized intelligence. So that continues to increase throughout your lifespan. Every time you're learning new things, you're adding to that crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is that ability to reason abstractly. So you take that knowledge that you have and you can twist it or think about it in different ways. Think of solutions that you've seen in the past, maybe solutions that have worked in this domain, and you try it in this domain, even if you've never seen that done before. So that ability to think kind of outside the box and reason more abstractly, that's fluid intelligence. So with that, we showed that previous research showed that that happens fairly early on, but we'll see today actually the longitudinal trends for a lot of cognitive capacities actually stay really stable throughout middle adulthood and even well into late adulthood as well. So let's do this little test. Essentially, I'll pause this video to let you think of a solution, like how you would solve this problem, and then you can put it in the chat. And we'll see who got it right or who came up with the good idea, who was able to think about this in a more fluid way, or who's seen this kind of test before as well. So let's try it out. All right, hopefully everyone's able to see it. Get the volume up. Make sure I'm not. Yep, it's normal speed. All right, let me know if audio or video is bad at all so that you can actually hear the instructions and things like that.
News. Research shows that some parts of the brain can actually improve with age, and we're about to put that theory to the test. Take a look at these 3 light bulbs. Each one is controlled by a different one of these switches. All you have to do is figure out which switch corresponds with which bulb, and then label the bulbs 1, 2, 3. The only problem is the switches are over here, and the bulbs are over here. You can turn the switches on and off as much as you'd like, but since the bulbs are in the other room, you won't be able to see them as you flip the switches. Then you only get one shot to go down the hall and label the bulbs correctly. So how would you figure out this problem?
All right, so I'll just repeat that problem again. So what we're doing here is you've got 3 switches. Each of these switches corresponds to one of these light bulbs. You don't know which one corresponds to which light bulb yet, and they're in separate rooms. So you have to flip the switches, and then you can only go and look one time. So you leave from behind this wall and come in, and that time that you come in, you have to label the light bulbs. So you can flip the switches in whatever order, however many times you want, but you only get to come and see these light bulbs that one time, and you don't go back to the switches after that. So you're at the switches for however long you want to be, and then you come here, and then you have to label the light bulbs. So think about it for a minute. So you've got the 3 switches in a separate room, then 3 light bulbs, but you need to figure out which switches correspond to which light bulbs without being able to go back and forth. So I'll give you maybe a minute to think of a solution. Then we'll see some of the other people's solutions and how they do at different age ranges for this. All right, it's been about a minute, so these participants have a lot longer than you have to figure this out. So as we watch the next couple moments of the video, if you think of something more or if you're still trying to figure it out, that's totally fine. Maybe like drawing a diagram, you could do that. So basically before they show the actual one of the actual solutions to it, in between now and then, feel free to put any kind of ideas that you have in the meeting chat. And then we'll come back to the meeting chat and we will see who got it right. I won't comment on them before we see the actual solution, so I don't give it away accidentally. All right, so let's continue watching this.
The truth is, bulbs correctly. So how would you figure out this problem? The truth is, you should be able to figure it out just as easily in your couch as if you were in this room. Now, while you think it over, we brought in some volunteers. 4 are in their early 20s, and 4 are 45 and older. We let them duke it out head to head. Who do you think will have more success figuring it out? Rob, are you ready to try this?
I am.
Go to town.
Let's see what happens over here. Put 2 on and 1. No, put 1. No, why would I want to put? Let's see what. 1. Number 3 on. 1. I don't know. Just put 2.
You're just guessing.
2 or 3 down. Yeah, I have no idea.
Rob is having a tough time with this challenge. Do you think everyone will struggle, or will some players have a flash of brilliance?
Can I have any hints?
No hints.
I'm going to shut this one off.
I'm thinking if I leave 1 and 3, no, because I don't know what order they're in.
Well, can I go look at the bulbs now?
If you think that gives you enough information to label all of them, then yes. So what are you going to turn on? Anything?
All right, I'll just put 2 and 3 on for now, and then.
And then you'll go and guess is what
Yeah.
you're saying.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take a shot in the dark.
Okay. Do you think the older brain's experience and wisdom will lead to victory? Or will our young brains demonstrate creative outside-the-box thinking to crack this?
This is 1 or 2.
I don't know.
This one's warm, so this one is number 3.
This guy's on the right track. Do you think the others are getting any bright ideas?
100%.
Is that right?
If I'm wrong, I'm just wrong.
I think I got it. It looks good.
Before we reveal which team won, we're going to reveal the solution. Were you able to figure out how to correct?
All right. I only see one response right now, and they're about to reveal the solution. So does anybody else have any ideas of how they might do this? So I'll give you about 30 seconds to type up a little response if you have any other ideas. All right. So we've got another response. Okay, we've got a couple more responses. Nice. So let's go through these responses. We've got our first response is flipping 2 switches, keep 1 left on and turn 1 off. So flip 2 on and then turn 1 of those off. And then you would go and check the lights. When you check the lights, you can touch them. And the coldest one that's off is the one you never turned on. And the warm one would be the one that you turned on and then off. And so that is one solution to the problem. So then you've left 1 on, so you can see which one it is. Maybe it's number 1 is the one that you've left on. Maybe 2 you turned on and then off. So that one should be warm. I mean, with something like an LED bulb, you'll probably have to leave it on for a little while before turning it off. And then the one that's off and cold is the last one. So that is actually one of the possible solutions to this. The first time I heard this problem, I took the next response, just wing it. I figured I would keep 1 on and kind of guess between the other 2. So that would have been my guess as well. And then we've got flip 1 and give it some time on to heat up and then turn it off. Flip another and know that the warmer one is the one that was on. So same kind of thing, but instead of flipping them on at the same time, you flip 1 on to get warm, turn it off, and turn another one on. And so you still have that same kind of solution that you can check. 1 should be off and cold, 1 will be off and warm, and 1 light bulb will be on. So yeah, good way to do that. Another way to get that same solution, because that's really the only way you can check is the light from the bulbs and the heat from the bulbs. I do wonder also if this will, if this specific problem, the solution might be more difficult for people now who have maybe light bulbs that aren't generally as warm. Like an LED bulb generally is a lot cooler if you say run it for 3 minutes than if you had a normal incandescent bulb that you run for 3 minutes. So I wonder if that would affect things too, if they used people at these same ages, like 10 years from now or something. I would have never thought to touch the bulbs. Yeah, that was me the first time too. I figured, oh, I would just look at it, but we have a lot of other senses that we could use it. So that's what we're talking about here, is that fluid intelligence. I wouldn't do that either, or I wouldn't have considered that right off the bat the first time I tried this. But that's part of fluid intelligence, is thinking, well, there's another way to solve this. This seems like a very visual problem, but we could use our sense of touch, or if there was some other aspect of it that you could smell or taste or something like that. In this case, probably not a good idea to taste a light bulb, but just as an example, you could try to think of other ways outside the box to do that. Then I would also flip 2 switches to see, and then so you could flip the 2 switches, and I think one of the participants guessed. So they had 1 off and then 2 on, and then they just kind of guessed between that which one was which. And so in that case, you've got a higher probability of guessing right rather than just going in and guessing all of them. So really good solutions there, and a couple different ways to get to the final result of having 1 bulb be kind of warm but off, and then 1 bulb be on and then 1 be off. So let's see how the participants did. You probably can already guess based on our discussion, and that we're in middle adulthood right now.
Label each bulb. All you have to do is turn on 2 of the switches. Leave both on for about a minute. Then turn 1 off and go into the other room. 1 bulb will be on. 1 will be off. The 3rd bulb will be off, but still warm. Do you think you know which team won this challenge? And the winners of our light bulb challenge are the older brains. Bring it! Yeah! Like a fine wine, you just get better with age. Surprised? Some might expect younger brains to win this challenge using what's called fluid intelligence.
I got it.
A skill generally thought to peak while you're younger that helps you solve novel problems and get to the bottom of things.
Yet only one of our younger players got it right.
You do not need to pay attention in science class.
However, 3 of our older brains solved it correctly by relying on crystallized intelligence. That's the ability to use knowledge and experience acquired over time to solve problems, a skill.
So they're describing this a little backwards. Yes, you definitely need that knowledge and experience. If you don't know that bulbs get hot, if that's not part of your crystallized intelligence, you can't do this. But that different solution to solving the problem, that is definitely a fluid intelligence task. So thinking about it a little outside the box rather than just using visual perception, using touch, that's thinking about it in a more fluid way. So yes, you definitely do need that crystallized intelligence to be able to understand that, well, light bulbs are going to get warm and how light bulbs work. But definitely the solution to the problem is requiring fluid intelligence. So you can't always get perfect videos on YouTube or even Discovery Channel and things like that. But overall, really good example of using that fluid intelligence to reason in another way. So with that, people tend to need that crystallized intelligence to be able to use fluid intelligence as well. So if you are an expert in a field, you're going to have a lot more accumulated knowledge within that field. So if you've been doing car maintenance for years and years and years, you've probably seen multiple different solutions to say get a stuck bolt out. And so when you see a new problem, a bolt stuck a little bit differently than you've ever seen before, that accumulated knowledge can really help you to say, well, maybe this would work, or this would work, or this won't work. And then even coming up with a new problem. So then thinking abstractly to solve the stuck bolt problem in another way that could combine a couple of the ways that you've seen before. So crystallized intelligence building can help you with your fluid intelligence. So questions about the solution there? Thanks for participating in that and trying to figure it out. Don't feel bad if you didn't get it. Like I mentioned, I didn't get it my first time either, and now I've seen it, so it's kind of cheating. All right, so let's talk about some longitudinal studies of cognitive abilities in middle adulthood. So the Seattle Longitudinal Study, it started in 1956, and with it, new groups of participants have been added over time. And so what that does, you follow the original group for a long period of time. And then as you go along, you might want to add new kinds of measures. If you started that then, and you have a better measure of, say, let's say creativity, 10 years in the future, you might have the next time they do the survey, they do both those creativity measures to make sure that they're lining up and correlating well. And then from then on, you'll use a new creativity measure. So you can change measures over time. You can add participants to the study. Usually with this, you'll add participants that are either the same age or the age that the participants were at the beginning of the study. So if you add people that are the same age as your current participants, let's say you started with 200 people and 10 years later, you now only have 100 people. Well, you probably want more people in your sample, so you might add another 200 people. So a total of 300 now completing the study, and you can compare them at the same age, see if they do look similar as they did before and as the remaining people do now. I'm kind of really briefly talking about like a couple different methods, things to make longitudinal studies work. But you could also add new people that are the initial age. So if you started when people were 20, now most of your participants are 40, you add new 20-year-olds, you can now compare the new 20-year-olds to the people who are now 40 and see if they're similar enough to look at trends and compare trends and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons you might add groups over time. One of the big ones is because a big limitation of longitudinal studies is people leaving the study or even dying as well. So your participant sample narrows down. And generally it narrows down in ways that are not random. And so that's really bad too. You want, if you have 1,000 people in your study and then 25% of them drop out. You don't want those 25% to be dropping out because they're the least healthy or because they're all the least experienced with technology. You don't want it to be some systematic reason. It would be better if it was just entirely at random. So just statistically, it's easier to figure things out if it is entirely random. And then you don't want to miss a whole population that was actually the least healthy when you're, say, tracking things. That group is really important. You could think of it as if a specific ethnicity suddenly dropped out of your sample, every member of that specific ethnicity, well, then you no longer can study that specific ethnicity in this longitudinal study, and that's really unfortunate. So that's why it's good to have it random, to have dropout. A little more methods than I had intended to go into with longitudinal studies, and I kind of just explained this question. So a longitudinal study, again, is you take a group of people and you follow them for a long period of time. Like other samples and other research methods in the science of psychology, the bigger and more diverse your sample is, the better your answers will be, and generally the more generalizable. So if we take a sample of 6,000 US 20-year-olds from across the country, from across socioeconomic statuses, from across ethnicities, sexual orientations, basically any demographics you might be able to ask. If we kind of get a random assortment of all those demographics, that would be a really great sample. If we get only a longitudinal study that's the same size still, let's say 3,000, I don't remember what my previous example was, but let's say both of them are 3,000, but those 3,000 are only students in four-year colleges. That's a lot narrower of a sample. So people that are going to college are probably systematically different in some ways than people going to, say, just a two-year college or a trade school or going straight into their careers. So you want to get as diverse of a sample as you can, as big of a sample as you can, if you're trying to generalize to other people. If you really are only interested in women who are 14 to 16 who have had cancer, then you'll want to select a sample that fits that, right? And there might be reasons that you'd want a very specific sample. But a lot of times, like with this one, they're trying to generalize to other adults in the population. So hopefully my jumping between topics in methods there wasn't confusing. So these are the kind of mental abilities, cognitive abilities tested in this study: verbal comprehension, verbal memory, spatial orientation, inductive reasoning, and perceptual speed. So hopefully you already remember the definitions of these different things. So these are things that they found increased in middle adulthood. So middle adulthood, verbal ability, verbal memory, inductive reasoning, spatial orientation, all increased. So while they watched these people over their lifespan, on average, that group that they were watching was increasing on these abilities. These things, numeric ability and perceptual speed, seem to decline in middle adulthood. Perceptual speed and hand-eye coordination specifically is a thing that actually decreases really early on in life. So if you look at a really good example of this is actually gaming competitions. So like first-person shooters or other gaming competitions, most of the participants there are younger than 25, because at about that point is when you start to lose a little bit of that hand-eye coordination. So might be one reason that parents are getting beaten in like Super Smash Brothers by their children. Doesn't happen to my kids yet. They don't really like playing video games with the buttons very much yet, which is too bad. So some things are increasing even in middle adulthood, and the main thing I wanted to point out with this longitudinal study and the other data we're going to be looking at is we oftentimes think of middle adulthood and late adulthood as times when you're declining, where a lot of those physical capacities towards the end of middle adulthood we talked about declining, but there's a lot of capacities that humans have that are increasing even at the end of middle adulthood, or that can be increased even if on average, people aren't increasing on numeric ability or perceptual speed. Numeric ability is something that you could definitely work on. If that was something that was of interest to you or mattered to you, you could use things like brain games or doing more math or something to increase that ability even in late adulthood. And that's one really great thing I think about cognitive development research is not just the general descriptive research that they do of looking at, on average, how do people do with cognitive abilities, but they also do a lot of applied research on, well, how can we stop people from losing this ability this early? Or if someone has Alzheimer's, what can we do to help them maintain their cognitive capacity? So that kind of applied research is really, really useful, I think, for everybody. Because especially using your brain, using those cognitive capacities, even if you lose physical capacities, you can still increase and use cognitive capacities, which I think is a really positive view of aging and adulthood as well. So let's see another couple findings on cognitive capacities that increase or are maintained or perhaps decline in middle as well as late adulthood in this video.
Aging is a natural process, and with it come changes in memory. Most people associate aging with declines in cognitive performance. My mom will say she's having a senior moment when she forgets something, for example. But never fear, not all cognitive changes in adulthood are negative. Some abilities remain relatively stable, and some even improve. So let's start with the positive. Abilities that remain stable. First of all, implicit memory stays about the same across the lifespan. In other words, once you've learned to ride a bike, that procedural memory is likely to stay with you as you age, barring any brain damage or disease. Recognition memory also stays relatively stable over time, meaning that once you learn something, your ability to pick it out of a list later remains about the same, whether you're 27 or 67. Now for abilities that improve. Semantic memory improves until around age 60 and only then starts declining. This means that older adults still have good verbal skills and why they make excellent crossword puzzle buddies. A related area in which older adults tend to score better than younger adults is crystallized intelligence, which involves the ability to use knowledge and experience. Since older adults have had more time to gain knowledge and experience, this pattern makes sense. And crystallized intelligence is often tested with reading comprehension and analogy tests, so older adults tend to be better at those than younger adults. Finally, older adults tend to be better at reasoning in the face of interpersonal or emotionally charged problems. Again, the theory is that with their greater experience and knowledge of these types of situations, they're more likely to have been through some similar situation and be able to draw from that experience. Of course, there are some cognitive abilities that decline as we age. Recall becomes more difficult. Although recognition is stable, it's harder for older adults than younger adults to generate responses without cues, like there are in a free recall or sometimes cued recall test. Similarly, episodic memory is impaired. Often, memories formed a long time ago will be relatively stable, but forming new episodic memories becomes more difficult as we age. Processing speed.
So that one is one that I still find really interesting, considering we've seen episodic memories improvement across the lifespan from, like here in this class, we've talked about it from the time that children were very young, that they don't really have episodic memories until generally people's first episodic memory is like when they're about 4 or 5, but it's really not possible to create those episodic memories till around age 2.5. But at that point, it starts just getting better and better and better. There's more aspects of life that you can connect to other episodic memories. Other similar things have happened to you. We did touch on one aspect of this when we got to about adolescence and early adulthood, that a lot of our episodic memories, that we tend to have more episodic memories in early adulthood and the end of adolescence, when there's lots of changes happening in life, new novel things. So part of this is probably down to that in midlife, if you're going to the same or similar job every day, you've got to set routine, then you might not be creating as many new episodic memories, but it might actually be causing your brain not to be doing as much work to maintain those episodic memories. But this again is one of those cognitive capacities that you could work on. You could work on developing new episodic memories if you're still doing new and novel things. All the way from early adulthood into late adulthood, you're going to be better. Like you individually will be making episodic memories, and your brain will be better at doing that. So all of these capacities, even this decline, you can work on those capacities that are declining. So the stats here are like on average, this is for most people what happens. These stay stable, these improve, these decline. If you don't want those to decline, work on them, and they won't. That's what we're finding, especially with applied research.
It slows down as we age, so if you're watching Jeopardy with Grandma, she might know just as many answers as you do, if not more, but she'll have a harder time outputting the response within such a short period of time. Related to processing speed, divided attention becomes more difficult. As we age, it becomes increasingly harder to effectively switch our attention between tasks, so we become more easily distracted. The bottom line is that cognitive changes in adulthood aren't all negative. Although some cognitive abilities do decline, it's important to remember that in healthy older adults, some cognitive abilities will remain stable or even improve.
So I think they're getting there at the end, kind of touching on the fact that obviously a neurological disease or disorder or things like that can change that outcome for any individual. So someone with Alzheimer's will obviously have different cognitive capacities because of that disease. So even there, though, there is a lot of applied research on what to do to help people maintain those capacities. All right, so here we see another graph from this longitudinal study. You can see the years down here. So 25 is where this graph started, even though I think they started the study earlier than that for participants. And then here in this graph, at least, we've got participants at 95. So middle adulthood is in here, so somewhere around 32 to 39, so somewhere in there is where people generally agree middle adulthood starts. And then around here, about 70 or 75 is when middle adulthood ends. So if you look at these capacities in general, a lot of these are really quite straight and stable across middle adulthood. So one thing that these longitudinal studies found is that when we actually watch the trend of people's intellectual capacities and their cognitive capacities, they stay really stable across middle adulthood. There is not much decline. And it's not actually really until late adulthood, so getting closer to the 90s, that we do see any dramatic drops. There's kind of a steady drop, and then towards the end of life, there's a more intense drop. So with that, we've done a lot of applied research to show that these kind of capacities can be maintained even till a person, like up to when a person dies. So for most of these capacities, which I think is a really optimistic way to look at aging and look at people's futures. That's one thing that I plan to work on myself is cognitive abilities as I age. So even if physical capacities are lost, then hopefully those cognitive capacities are not myself. So when we look at this, I think I have another graph that shows, here we go. So when we look at these same kind of findings in a cross-sectional study, so this is calling back to like chapters 1 and 2. A cross-sectional study is where you take people at different ages. So you take a sample of 25-year-olds, you take a sample of 46-year-olds, you take a sample of 67-year-olds and a sample of 81-year-olds, and you'd study them all on one day. And from that, you might then infer something about the aging process. So this shows why that can be a weakness. Because when you do that kind of cross-sectional study, you find the more steep declines that we have tended to hear about or think about. But when you actually watch and follow people across time, you see that their capacities stay really stable. So this is probably just an artifact of things like history effects, people that are older versus younger, grew up at a different time. So if you're measuring 80-year-olds versus 20-year-olds today, their development, their aging, they grew up at a different time, different things were happening to them, versus if you follow the same group of people, you can see that they stay really stable. Maybe this is because the methods used stay consistent for that, versus maybe the 80-year-olds, the test for them is not as well suited to them as it is for a 20-year-old. And this is something that is sometimes a problem in doing research, is that the kind of measure you are using might be well suited to, say, a 25-year-old, but that same measure might not be the best way to measure, let's say, crystallized intelligence or fluid intelligence in an 80-year-old. You can probably get that idea if you compare. I wouldn't give a 6-year-old a survey, like something that they would have to read and then respond to, like a couple bubbles, but I could probably do that with, say, a 20-year-old. Like they could say, I agree or disagree with that. I wouldn't do that with a 6-year-old, though. There would be other ways to try and measure some capacity. So similar kind of thing. There's probably better ways to measure an 80-year-old and a 25-year-old when you're talking about cognitive capacities. Perceptual speed, you can probably like put their brains on an EEG or an MRI and measure it that way, and that would be a really good way to get the same kind of assessment. But for all these different cognitive capacities, there's you might not be able to do that. So main point is longitudinal studies really show that these intellectual capacities, these cognitive capacities stay stable. Cross-sectional studies are a lot easier to do. You do it today, then get a paper out. But the weakness of that is, well, we kind of missed this fact that people's intellectual cognitive capacities can be maintained for a long period of time. All right, let's go back to this. So any questions as we go through? Because I know that video defined some of the cognitive capacities, but if you're like, what does this mean? Feel free to ask. So that's kind of what we're going over here for a few of these. So speed of information processing, things like reaction time tests are used to test this. So in middle adulthood, you'll be slightly slower than adolescents. So this is one kind of simple and silly example, not really great methodology here. You could have a researcher drop a ruler and then a participant catch it, and then you measure, well, how many inches did it take for them to catch it? So that's a really crude measure of reaction time. A better measure of reaction time would be, you could just take this and take out some of these variables by having a computer and a robot just randomly drop the ruler. So that would be a little better. Another thing you can do is scan a brain to see when does the brain actually recognize and make the decision to grab the ruler. There's a lot of other ways, or a button or something like that. There's a lot of ways to do reaction time. This is just one simple example. So there's cognitive causes for that decline in speed, and a lot of it's just neuroanatomical. So we've talked about myelin speeding things up. If there's a lack of myelin, for example, in diseases like multiple sclerosis, myelin is basically going away. You're losing myelin around nerves, so your processing speed is going to be declining. As you age, you might be losing myelin, so that means processing speed is going to be a little slower. And neurochemical, so obviously we've talked about how a neuron sends a message to another neuron through different chemical signals. Hopefully you remember things like serotonin and dopamine. So if that process, if you've got too much or too little of any of those chemicals, that can cause that as well. So verbal memory declines during middle adulthood. So with this, there's a disagreement if this memory is declining in middle adults, or that if it's in late middle adulthood. So this goes back to that there's probably different phases of middle adulthood, and I suspect we'll see like a late middle adulthood as like a phase versus an early middle adulthood or something like that, to kind of delineate these differences. So there is agreement that there's some decline in late middle adulthood, but overall in middle adulthood it stays pretty stable. So with this, we do need more time in middle adulthood to learn new information. So you can teach an old dog new tricks. It might just take a little more effort, a little more time. So with this, This is related to working memory and using ineffective memory strategies. So that's obviously something that you can work on. You can work on using your working memory, using it more effectively, using new memory strategies to learn something new. So with that, if you don't do those kinds of things, if you don't try to maintain or increase these capacities of working memory or using poor memory strategies, you're going to be solving problems slower, making decisions slower, comprehending things slower. So with that, use memory strategies as you get into middle adulthood. Learn new memory strategies. One example that we've talked about before is mnemonics. Mnemonics can be really good for like doing well on an exam or remembering your shopping list. So there's a lot of different kinds of mnemonics. That's one example of a memory strategy, and there's a lot of different mnemonics to try. So expertise. So this really lines up well with the 1,000 hours idea. So if you do something for 1,000 hours, you might be an expert in it. So essentially, this is building your crystallized intelligence. You are building expertise by working in something or learning something. So with this, when you have that more bigger accumulated knowledge, that's more crystallized intelligence, you can process information in relation to that domain really quickly, analyze it really efficiently, see what and what is not a problem. So if I, actually kind of a funny example, I just had a bug sprayer come to our house, and they asked me a couple questions about like the house or where we've seen bugs and things like that. And so the questions that they asked were different than what I would have necessarily expected. So they listened to what I said, and they picked up on specific things that were surprising to me, essentially because they had the expertise to know like what to focus on, what problems might exist in that realm. I've seen that when like working on my motorcycle or cars, is I often try to do things myself, and then when I screw something up, I have to take it in. So seeing that person's accumulated experience, their expertise in that field, they can really quickly solve a problem that stumped me, a novice in these areas. So hopefully you can think of your own examples. Maybe you were the expert in some realm, and you can come up with a solution really easily or really quickly, versus someone who's new to that kind of domain is not going to be able to do that as well or as quickly. So with this, shortcuts and solving problems, you tend to be better at doing fluid intelligence tasks when you have more accumulated experience. So with this, everyday problem solving is something we use our cognition for every day, and this tends to increase between early adulthood and middle adulthood, and then it doesn't tend to decline until late middle adulthood. So you might call practical problem solving wisdom. The research on wisdom is actually, we won't actually go into that tangent, but it's messier than you might expect. The definition of wisdom, how different cultures view wisdom, how wisdom affects a person versus people around them. It's kind of a messier field of research than you might have expected. Yeah, not one that I'm an expert in at all. So we've talked about this. All right, so those are the main things I wanted to touch on with cognitive capacities. We're definitely going to come back and talk about cognitive capacities when we're talking about late adulthood. But right now we'll move to careers and work and leisure, and then we'll talk about some meaning in life as well in middle adulthood. Before we get to those, let's take a quick break. Let's be back at, let's say, 9:20. Yeah, 9:20 should work just fine. So let's take a quick break and be back at 9:20. All right, and we are back. So let's shift to talking about careers, work, and leisure in middle adulthood. This is definitely related to the socio-emotional development in the next chapter, but it's also related to, I mean, think about the systems that a person is involved in, the context, how they change and develop over time. So your book kind of puts this right here in this chapter, even though I think maybe it fits a little better in the socio-emotional chapter, but it still is important. So I guess it doesn't really matter which chapter it's in. All right, so with this, the work is really central to a lot of middle adults. It's a big part of their identity. This is one thing that might change about their identity if they say have to shift careers or they go from a position. Oh no, it looks like it kicked me out of my meeting. So I just got the notice that I was out of the meeting, so I don't know if how long that was for. Okay, you can still hear me? That's so strange. Well, I'm glad you could, but I wish it wouldn't send me those kind of warnings if it's not actually a problem. But good. So identity, career, big piece of it is one of those examples of things that can change about identity in middle adulthood. If you go from to now, maybe you're trying to be more generative, so you take on an apprentice, your identity might change because now that rather than just being a worker, maybe you're a manager or you are a master in the field. Who's the person above the apprentice? Is that a master in the field? My verbal memory is not working right now. So with this, in the US, about 80% of people age 40 to 59, so in that middle adulthood range, are employed. So most people in this age range are employed, and so it can be a big part of their time, just day by day, a big part of their identity, a big part of the peer groups that they're around, possibly friends, things like that. So with this, especially towards the end of middle adulthood, it's a big time for evaluating and assessing and reflecting on the work that you've done through your lifespan up to this point. Is that consistent with who you see yourself as is it consistent with your identity? Are there things you need to change? So these are pretty similar experiences for middle adults. Also, a lot of financial responsibilities on average at this time in life. So for US samples, oftentimes there's mortgage or rent to be paid, medical bills. This might be a time, especially in middle adulthood, when like we talked about in physical health, there might be new medical bills or new things that you're finding that you have to pay that weren't there before. Home repair, maybe paying college tuition for children, and also possibly bills from nursing homes for older parents, or bringing those older parents to live with you and trying to decide that. So there's a lot of responsibilities in general, not just financial responsibilities at this time in middle adulthood. So there are challenges with this, with the systems that we live in relation to careers. So there is a lot of companies that are restructuring, downsizing, and outsourcing jobs outside the U.S. so they can pay less for labor. With this, a lot of middle-aged workers or late adults are asked to leave or incentivized to leave and retire earlier. One not really good. One example of this is actually my father-in-law, who worked for the same company essentially his entire life. They transitioned through a couple different companies, like different companies kind of bought them, or like more companies were absorbed into them. It's a pretty big company in the aerospace industry. So because he'd been there for so long and been a loyal employee, his pay was much higher for the jobs that he was doing than if they, say, trained someone new to do that job. So there were a lot of incentives pushed towards him and a lot of really negative things as well within the context of the company to make him want to leave, essentially. So there was the like financial incentives. Hey, we'll give you these kind of bonuses if you retire early, as well as making the job kind of unbearable for the people who had been there for a long time. So a lot of companies are doing that to people in middle adulthood, or if you're sticking with work into late adulthood, basically try to push out these laborers who they're having to pay more because of their experience and their time, that they've been a loyal employee. They'd rather hire someone new for a shorter period of time, train them to do that specific task, and pay them less. So that can be a really big challenge, especially when work is such a big part of your life. So if you're now in a situation where your friends are taking these incentives and leaving work, retiring early, you're retiring yourself early, that changes a lot and can change a lot about your identity. It can be a challenging time. So with this, also, pensions aren't necessarily assured anymore. Healthcare is more and more expensive all the time. So that's a worry as well. So if I leave, do I still get to keep this healthcare, or did I even have healthcare? These are really big questions that people in middle adulthood might not have expected when they got into their careers in the first place. So with this, they might change careers if they feel behind in their plan for the job. Maybe in early middle adulthood, they wanted to be at like a couple levels higher in the kind of company. So maybe they move to a different company and kind of hop around to different kinds of industries or things like that. If they want to get more advancement, trying to rather get promotions within one specific area, try to jump up in promotions with different companies. So with that, a lot of middle adults feel a lot more self-motivated, and so like an intrinsic motivation for working. So talking about work isn't necessarily the most fun, because most of the things that we're talking about there are challenges with work. But work is a part where a lot of people do get and can find a lot of purpose and meaning, feel like they're achieving goals, give back to people, be generative. So I know a lot of the focus there was on a lot of negative aspects around work, and those exist for sure. And I don't want to downplay basically either the positives or the negatives for someone in middle adulthood. So leisure times, basically defined as the pleasure times outside of work, pursuing your own activities, own interests, own hobbies. So sports, reading, going on hikes. There's a lot of different things that middle adults might be finding themselves with more time or maybe more money to do. So most middle adults regret not taking enough leisure time. So when they're asked, like in longitudinal studies or even in cross-sectional studies throughout middle adulthood, most of them are saying, well, they wish, and this is also very US samples too here. Most of our samples that we talk about in the class come from the US. They regret not taking more leisure time as opposed to not spending more time at work. So with this, the more you're taking time for these leisure pursuits, it's correlated to better cognitive function. Some of this is probably causal. So if you're having new and novel experiences, let's say you travel to a new place and see something new. Maybe you go to a cave and you've never been in a cave before. That's a new novel experience that'll be related to creating new memories. So some cognitive capacities are going to still be boosted and be used in that kind of situation. So there's probably some causal relationships there, but it is correlated to better cognitive functioning, longer life. So changes in midlife might lead people to have more opportunities for leisure. So if they have more disposable income, for example, maybe they can take a cruise. Also, non-active leisure pursuits, so things like watching TV, are correlated with shorter telomeres. And I don't remember if we talk about telomeres in detail. If we've talked about them yet, we'll talk about them as we get into late adulthood. Telomeres are essentially the parts on your chromosomes and your DNA that essentially every time a cell replicates, a little bit of this telomere can get chopped off. It's like extra DNA at the end of your DNA strand, because we've evolved to like duplicate the DNA, but if there's any errors, usually it's the ends that get chopped off. If it's in the middle, then there's crazy mutations in something like cancer. But generally, we've evolved so that the ends of that DNA get chopped off. And so the shorter your telomeres get, it's kind of like your biological clock. At that point, your cells don't replicate properly and just everything kind of falls apart. As a really brief discussion of telomeres. We'll definitely talk about them more as we talk about physical development in late adulthood. But if you're doing non-active leisure in middle adulthood, your telomeres are going to be shorter. Well, okay, that was a little bit causal there, but there probably are some causal relationships leading to that. That when you're doing non-active leisure, you've got shorter telomeres. Maybe both are caused by some third source. But yeah, it's a thing to be worried about and work on. So being active throughout midlife, and we'll definitely talk about being active through late adulthood as well, are some of the biggest things you can do to extend your life and make new memories, use cognitive capacities. So religion and meaning in life. We talked about purpose in life as well in previous classes, but we see a lot of correlations with health. So again, things that are personally meaningful are things that an individual finds really useful or meaningful or important to them. So this might be a religion, this might be nature, this might be other people like a family, this might be animals. There's a lot of things that it can be your job. Maybe you find your job really meaningful to you. So there's a whole variety of things that could be personally meaningful. And so a big key is finding for yourself what are things, and it's generally a lot of things for anybody. Like maybe there's one thing that they feel most meaningful or they find most meaningful, but there's often for any individual multiple things that they find meaningful in life. So you could do personally meaningful careers like as a doctor, or you could have personally meaningful hobbies like going on hikes that might be really meaningful to you. So religion is related to this as well. A lot of people find meaning in their religion. So the definition of religion we're using here, and depending on the field and so if you're looking at sociology versus psychology versus religious studies specifically, they might have slightly different definitions of what a religion is. So definitely be aware of that if you say do a question paper. Like look at the definition, see if a paper that you're looking at in relation to religion is really getting at what you're wanting to. They're very overlapping, just so you know. There's slightly different definitions when you take a look at it from a sociology versus psychology versus religious studies angle. So for our purposes, religion is an organized set of beliefs, practices, rituals, and symbols that increase an individual's connection to some kind of sacred or transcendent other. So you need those components. So beliefs is pretty universal in all the definitions, whether you're sociology or not. Practices and rituals as different things. So there's specific rituals you might do, but also practices as well. So we won't go too much into depth with the definition, but essentially the rituals would be like things that are part of the religion that you would do in like steps, like moving up a religion, or like as you age in a religion, or for specific kind of events or holidays, versus practices are kind of like the more general things that you do in relation to the religion. That's not a ritual necessarily, but it's something that you meet on these days versus these days, or something like that might be a practice. Also, maybe specific health practices. So religiousness is a degree to which an individual is affiliated with a religious organization. So if you're always going to church once or twice a week or something like that, you're doing all the rituals, you're like on track with your religion, I guess you could say it that way, you would probably rank highly in religiousness, versus if you weren't associated with any religion, you weren't doing any religious practices or rituals, you would probably rank very low on religiousness. Now, with this, also, if you feel a sense of connection with its beliefs, you might not be involved in the rituals, but so one person that's involved in the rituals but doesn't really feel a connection with its beliefs, they might rank at the same level as someone who isn't actually involved in the rituals but feels a strong connection with the beliefs. Then someone who both feels that connection and is doing the rituals would probably rank higher in religiousness. So with this, levels of spirituality in general. So now we're jumping from religiosity to spirituality, and I think we've got the definition. Maybe I didn't actually put the diff. So religion is this beliefs, practices, rituals. Spirituality is more a sense of personal connection with some kind of transcendent other, whether it can be, some sacred or transcendent thing. So religion is that set of beliefs or practices. Spirituality is sense of connection. You don't necessarily have to have the beliefs and practices for spirituality. So with that, we see that in middle adulthood, and especially towards late middle adulthood, we see more levels of spirituality and generally more levels of, or heightening levels of religiousness as well. So doing the practices, being involved, those kinds of things. So religion is positively linked to health behaviors. So with this, it can also help with things like moderating blood pressure and hypertension, reducing stress. So it can. There are different cults and religions that promote dangerous or poor health practices. So not all religions are equal in that. So while in general and on average, religion does tend to be correlated with better health, reducing stress, you have a community of people that you probably believe similarly to, that you can use as a resource, and novel interactions and social interactions. Go for it. Definitely feel free to ask any questions.
I just wanted to ask, so when you say that people later in life tend to find religion, is that American specific, or is that general across all cultures that we know?
That's a really good question. And my answer is actually, I'm not sure. I would assume that the research I've read is mostly US or Western samples. Most of it's been US. Other samples I've looked at have been also Western. So Europe, Canada, Australia. Question for diving into this a little more. So sorry, I don't really have an answer other than I'm not sure. But yeah, that's a really good question. Generally religion can have a benefit for your health, but if there's specific practices that are not promotive to health, obviously that kind of undoes the benefit to health. So let's watch a little video about meaning in life. So you might have heard of Viktor Frankl. If not, this would be a good chance to get familiar. And Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. So let's watch this. I am sure there is research on other cultures. That would be a really good example of something to look into for cross-cultural research if you are interested in it for a question paper. But yeah, for myself, I don't actually know if that same trend exists in other cultures. I'm going to pull up my notes on the other screen so I can, because it's a fairly long video and I don't want to watch the whole thing. So here Frankl is being interviewed about his research, as well as how his time in, I believe he was in Auschwitz, how that influenced his research and thinking around meaning in life.
Also about this existential frustration is also observable in the communist countries. They commit.
So are you saying in order to meaning, it is necessary to experience suffering?
I wouldn't say it is necessary to experience suffering. What I say is just that meaning can be found under each and every condition in life, even under the worst conceivable conditions, provided that it is a situation you cannot change Remember, I said this explicitly. That means, provided that the cause of your suffering cannot be removed. If you can remove the cause of the suffering, say in case of a cancer, by surgery, you have to undergo surgery. If you are suffering from a severe compulsive obsessive neurosis, you have to seek psychotherapeutic help. There are, within the realm of logotherapy, for instance, certain techniques that can be applied with much success, as has been evidenced not by logotherapists but by behaviorists. And finally, if you are confronted with the sociological conditions that have caused your suffering, then you are called upon to change the situation, to remove the cause of your suffering by political action, for instance. But in this respect, I would like to make another additional statement by telling you something that I, a couple of weeks ago, have told my professors and students forming my audience at the Karl Marx University in Moscow. I was invited by the prorector to...
So as I jump forward to the next section, the main points I'm wanting to get out from this video are, and he's talking about different contexts in the beginning and here about different contexts and different economic systems that might lead to or challenge finding meaning. But here the main point is that you can, one of Frankl's big ideas was that you can find meaning in any kind of aspect of life. It can be in suffering, but it's not required to have gone through suffering to find things that are meaningful. A lot of his work in logotherapy is trying to help someone find meaning, find the things that are meaningful to them in their own life.
People have become insolvent or without jobs. The political future is far from settled. Do you have a message for us, a message that could give us hope and meaning?
You see, the only message I can deliver is a principle that I have adopted. I well remember throughout the days I had to spend in Auschwitz. There is statistical evidence that my chance to survive Auschwitz, real statistical evidence, was 29-1. And I had the feeling that it was like that. And still, I applied the philosophy of Sir Karl Popper, whose nucleus means that you cannot prove any hypothesis. The only thing you can do is falsify it, show that it is not valid, that it is not tenable.
So hopefully you recognize the terms like falsification from the beginning of this course. So Karl Popper was just publishing as Frankl was starting his own work. And so that idea of falsification, of trying to prove a theory false, rather than you can't do things to confirm a theory, to actually test a theory, you have to work to try and prove it false in any case. So he's talking about using that and applying it to life, and specifically applying it to finding meaning. So hopefully you recognize and can kind of make that transition that Frankl's making here, that philosophy of science idea into a philosophy, kind of a more life philosophy, is what he's talking about, transitioning that to.
Popper, whose nucleus means that you cannot prove any hypothesis. The only thing you can do is falsify it, show that it is not valid, that it is not tenable. And without knowing his philosophy, I only met him the first time a couple of years ago, I applied this theory inasmuch as I told myself, Victor, the chances are very, very low and small. Probably you will be sent to the gas chamber. And still, there is nobody who can guarantee me and convince me with 100% certainty that I shall not survive but end in the gas chamber. As long as I have no guarantee that I will have to die within the next days, I continue behaving and acting as if I would spare this fate.
Dr. Frankel,
So talking about how that kind of motivated him. And so a lot of Frankel's personal meaning, and you can get this from his work as well, was around helping other people through doing therapy. And so logotherapy was his specific type of therapy that he worked on, and a lot of it focused on helping people find meaning. And this is actually the starting point for a lot of the current research on meaning and purpose. So adding in more research methods, following that, expanding it to additional people types of things, making definitions a lot more clear. Meaning and purpose for a while were used interchangeably. Now they're seen as very distinct constructs in the field of psychology. And so now the research that we do in purpose in life, we can trace the roots back to some of the things that Frankl published. So with that, some of the most distinct human qualities that he focused on with logotherapy are spirituality, freedom, and responsibility. So emphasizing that people are unique and that they might have their unique things that they're responsible for, their unique spirituality, as well as that drive for freedom. And you might be able to see how some of these might have been emphasized or come to him through his own personal life experiences during that time. So with this, later researchers, Baumeister and Vos, have four main needs. So they kind of took these ideas, the distinct human qualities, and saw that, well, there's other things too. So adding on to those or pulling them out and piecing them out. So a need for purpose, a need for values. When they first mentioned need for purpose, it was still being interchangeably used with meaning. So you could say a need for meaning there. That'd be pretty accurate. A need for values, so personal things that are important to you and that you value and that you want to work towards, or that are important for your behavior. A sense of self-efficacy, and we've mentioned some of the research in relation to self-efficacy before when we were talking about it in adolescence and late childhood and early adulthood as well. That self-efficacy is a really big part of a person feeling good about themselves, feeling self-worth. So with this, a lot of these are very correlated to one another. If you increase your self-efficacy, you'll tend to increase your self-worth. If you're living based on your values, you'll tend to see that you're applying things to your meaning in life. So there's a lot of overlap with these constructs still. So with that, we're out of time for this group discussion. Darn it. This is a really good one, and I think it's good to talk about like immediately after we've been talking about these constructs. So depending on, this is one of the last topics in this chapter. I do want to have this discussion, so I'll see, since it's after the weekend, that's a long time in between discussing this and having this activity. We might skip this activity, or we might start with this first thing next time. Essentially, in the meantime, in between now and next class, whether or not we do this activity, think about how purpose and meaning, I'm using them interchangeably here, might look different in middle adulthood as to in adolescence. So for an adolescent versus an early adult versus a middle adult, what kinds of things might bring them meaning? What similarities might exist in things that bring you meaning across that time? What differences might there be? And then what challenges do you think people who don't engage in meaningful activities face in middle adulthood? So for middle adults specifically, if they're not able to do something meaningful, whether it's by a hobby or a job or whatever, what kinds of challenges might that present to them? So that is the end of our time. We might do this activity. If not, definitely give it a thought in between now and the next class. So thanks for being here today, and have a great rest of your day.